Good evening, everybody. Firstly, can I say a huge thank you to the musicians? It was just, I only got bits and pieces of it, but it was so beautiful, and I just love hearing the girls sing and play, and it's wonderful, so thank you very much. Welcome to our 150th Big Debate. It's such a pleasure to see many members of our community here, and some online, I know. I do want to start tonight with just a little bit of protocol. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if there is an alarm, then you can exit either side straight out, and we'll assemble on the quad just out front there. Can I also take a moment to thank our sponsors tonight who made it possible for Michael to join us and also to be here tomorrow to deliver the Principal's Lecture to students from across the island. So a huge thank you to both the Ned Forum and Investec, without whom none of this would have been possible. I also do want to take a moment to thank firstly our student speakers, one of whom is mid-mocks, for putting the time into building the arguments and shaping their speeches, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say later. And in addition, can I thank Heidi for being the opposition speaker tonight. In the short time I've known Heidi, I've realised that she encompasses the idea, nevertheless she persisted. She has an indomitable spirit, and I'm delighted, if slightly intimidated, to be debating against her this evening. Finally, I wanted to thank and welcome Michael. Michael has spent much of his career trying to expose truth. He did it during apartheid in South Africa and was thrown out of the country for it. He did it during the Ethiopian famine, single-handedly turning the world's attention to the devastating and horrific truth of global poverty and sparking the Live Aid movement. And he's done it in his pursuit of objectivity in every element of his reporting throughout his career. And this desire to expose truth has also led to Michael and my shared belief in the power and importance of debate and discussion. Michael believes, as is evident on the moral maze, that it is through pitting ideas against each other, rigorously interrogating positions and facts, that we come closer to finding truth, that we come closer to those points of connection which enable humanity to move forward. I was thus so pleased and delighted when he agreed to come to Guernsey to chair the 150th year celebration Big Debate at the college. There couldn't be someone who would bring more warmth, wisdom and incisive thinking to tonight's event. So thank you, Michael, and I'm very grateful that you and Christine agreed to travel over and see us. And whilst I know you have a reputation for neutrality, I remain optimistic that you will skew the debate in my favour. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Buerk. So just before, actually, I did it wrong. Just before I pass to Michael, I want to get the count. So I'll just give the count to Michael. As you came in, got the counts, Michael, and Michael will handle that.
Anyway, she's an old flatterer, really, and nobody says no to Daniele. Oh, now that is really interesting. Well, good evening, and can I add my welcome to Daniele's? I've been really looking forward to this because I absolutely love debate, as Daniele suggested. I love the cut and thrust of argument, and to, if you like, test my own ideas and refine my own thoughts, which actually need quite a lot of refining sometimes. But there's a sense, really, that that sort of thing is going out of fashion in an age of social media, where there seems to be a tendency to try to suppress views that you don't agree with rather than contest them. And I think that that is dangerous. And how wonderful, incidentally, to be debating this in the Ladies' College in its 150th anniversary, established all that long ago by far-sighted Guernsey people who wanted their daughters to have the same sort of education as their sons, with all the opportunities and possibilities that that includes. Right, the motion tonight is that this House believes that sexism is worse today than it was 30 years ago. Let's define our terms. Sexism is prejudice or discrimination based on sex and gender, particularly, but not exclusively, against women and girls. Sexism, I imagine, has been with us since the dawn of humanity. Its present iteration as an ism probably emerged from the second wave of feminism in the 1970s to counter all those ideas that one sex is superior to or more valuable than the other, and that limits should be placed on what particularly girls can and should do. How much has it changed? Well, that's the argument we're about to have. Just one nugget. A recent Pew Research Centre survey reported that 63% of women said sexism was a real obstacle now, today. 63% of women only 41% of men. Right. Debating this, for the proposition, Daniele, Harford-Fox, of course, principal of the Ladies' College, inspirational teacher, all-round good egg, and a friend. Though my neutrality is absolutely ironclad tonight. Supporting her for the proposition that sexism is worse, Sophie Kent from the Ladies' College Upper Sixth, where she's been doing history, economics and English literature, still young in years, but a veteran and formidable debater. Opposing the motion, the lead is Deputy Heidi Soulsby, MBE, serving Deputy of the States, of course, and former first female Deputy Chief Minister. Again, a formidable force in this debate. And backing her up, seconding the opposition to the motion, is Mia Edgworth from the lower sixth, currently studying psychology, economics and religious studies at A-level, with ambitions to study law at university. She is a political and debating animal, with several victories to her credit already. So here's how it's going to work, very briefly. The lead speakers, that's Daniele and Heidi, will get 7 minutes exactly, starting with the proposer of the motion, who's Daniele, of course, and then over to the opposition. Daniele's second, Sophie, will get 4 minutes. 5.
Sorry, that's my writing.
Yep. 5 minutes. Wow. And we'll end that session with Mia, also 5 minutes. Now, I am going to be very, very strict on the timings. I have this gavel. Actually, it's Danielle's gavel. In my hand, it's a dangerous weapon. They're not going to go, a second, more than a second after that. And Imogen on my right here is going to be the enforcer, or at least she's going to be working the clocks, and I'll be the enforcer. But you won't get any more time. The gavel will see to that. Then, after we've heard from all four, we'll take questions from the floor addressed to the speakers and their arguments. So can you be thinking of those while the arguments are going on? Because that is often one of the most interesting parts of the debate, when people from the audience say, "You said," but you know the sort of thing. But that's going to be really crucial. We'll have a big run round and we'll take them to test. That'll be fun. And then the concluding, summarizing arguments from the principal speakers, reversing the order, as Heidi will start for 4 minutes? Yeah. 4 minutes. 4 minutes each. Heidi starts, and then Daniele finishes for 5 minutes. You may notice that Daniele is starting and finishing, but she is the principal of the Ladies' College. Now, the interesting thing is you have already cast your vote on this motion before you've actually heard the arguments. So we know what you came in thinking. And the noes, that's against the proposition. The noes against the proposition, 73. The ayes for the proposition, in other words, the ayes thinking that it's worse, sexism's worse now than it was, 55. 73 to 55. So ground to be made up on my left here. And then, of course, after we've heard the arguments, after we've heard the summaries, after we've had the back and fro from the audience, we want to see what you think after you've heard the argument. So on one level, there's a kind of straight victory to be had in this vote at the end of the whole thing. But maybe the interest and maybe the virtuous victory will go to the side that's actually shifted the vote its way. So we'll have that vote, a show of hands, a bit of patience from you while we collate all the results, and then we will have it. Brilliant. And so to the lists. First up, for the proposition that this House believes that sexism is worse today than 30 years ago, the principal of Guernsey Ladies' College, Daniele Harford-Fox.
Sexism is about culture. It's not about law or representation, although we often think it is. It's actually about culture. Who holds the power? What are they motivated to do? What drives them? 30 years ago, the direction of travel was to improve. Steadily, more women were employed, more women were heard. It became increasingly likely that someone would call you out for a sexist joke or statement. So why am I standing here today saying it's worse than it was then? I'm standing here today because the game is changing. I'm standing here today because what drives legal change, what impacts on whether we appoint a woman or even listen to a woman on a board, is culture. And beneath our feet, probably without most of us even being aware of it, the ground is reshaping. Fueled by algorithms, fueled by the ability for one malevolent speaker to access and tap into the secret fears and desires of millions, there is a sea change occurring, and it is gaining momentum. And if we don't do something, if we don't figure out how to respond, it is going to change the rules of the world we live in. So today I'm going to explain why I think the game is changing, why without us being even aware of it, I think we are at a turning point, why our current culture, our current context is creating the fertile ground to not only allow a birth of a new and more malevolent movement of misogyny, but to allow it to breed. The time is right, the ground is fertile, and the mechanism for spread is more potent than we have ever seen before. In the last 50 years, there has been change. There has been a gradual shifting of power. Women aren't equal in terms of representation, but they're increasingly present. Conversations are having to change, language is having to change, culture is having to change, and that has left a lot of men, particularly young men, feeling lost, discombobulated, and without a sense of status and purpose. And so, like Trump speaking inherent racist beliefs with confidence and a lack of shame to his white base, these movements now speak the secret desires of some men. They tell them that men are actually superior, that it is right and proper for women to be subservient, that men are designed to be sexually promiscuous and women are designed to be objectified. They tell them that feeling of resentment, of discombobulation, that feeling that they don't get sufficient respect is due to the world going mad and that we have to get it back to the way that things should work. It's an intoxicating message, particularly for a young man who might be socially struggling, particularly for a young man who is desperate to have a sense of purpose, desperate to feel superior to something, desperate to feel that his anger and his resentment at the world not delivering on its implicit promises is somebody else's fault. And that is the fertile ground. When you look at the murders by incels, an online group of misogynists, the murders by Elliot Rodgers, Nicholas Cruz, Alec Manassin, and many, many others, you see the dance playing out. Young men without social power and capital, who egg each other on, who feel entitled to status, entitled to the admiration and fear of women and other men, engaging in mass shootings to demonstrate who is actually in control. There is a reason that the white supremacy riots in Carolina started in men's rights groups online. There is a reason most mass shooters start with domestic violence. Because the heart of all this is a belief that men should have more power, and subjugating women is the first sign of that. And so the first strategy of this new movement is to feed that need, to validate that feeling that you should have more power, that you are entitled to own women's bodies, that you are entitled to control and subjugate. The next magic ingredient in a world of post-truth and conspiracy theories is to ensure that that argument cannot be challenged or undermined. At the heart of sexist movements, as psychologist Sandra Ben points out, is always biological essentialism, an unchallengeable, unarguable belief that men and women are by their nature fundamentally very different and thus should be treated differently. Whether it's American evangelicals pushing complementarianism, i.e. the idea that God wants men and women to take different roles and that a woman's role should be to submit to the leadership of men, or whether it's Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson using pseudo-scientific evolutionary theories of how men and women evolved to justify male dominance, the claims are designed in such a way they can't be disproved. There's no empirical evidence for an evolutionary driver of male dominance because evolutionary psychology cannot be empirically tested. There's no proof that God wants women to be subservient because his text is being subjectively interpreted by male leaders. They are impossible to disprove. Yet they create an air of legitimacy. And in their fetid culture of conspiracy theories and rabbit holes, they feed their followers psychological needs that they are morally or scientifically right to want more dominance and power, and that they alone can see the truth. They've taken the red pill, as one part of the movement says, and can now see the world as it actually should be, rather than the unnatural and manipulated world of gender equality created by the feminists. But really, all this would be fine if it was just limited to the pub. Andrew Tate would mean nothing if he was just an angry, lonely man sitting in the corner of the Red Lion, mouthing off to anyone who would listen. Even if he was Nigel Farage, his reach would only be limited to those listening to BBC News. But Andrew Tate is not sitting in the pub. He's sitting on TikTok. And Jordan Peterson isn't sitting in a group therapy room. He's posting video after video on YouTube. And the game changer in all this, ladies and gentlemen, is algorithms. Algorithms are essentially designed to radicalize. You see, an algorithm's aim is to keep you watching. And they know the best way to keep your attention is to present increasingly provocative and interesting material. Thus, someone starts with a simple search on male strength or male paternity pay, and quickly the game begins. Video after video of increasingly provocative material that by its nature becomes more dark, more disturbing, and more radical.
1 minute.
This isn't specific speed up. By the way to misogyny, it's exactly the same dynamic that's fueling QAnon. But the internet is dominated by young men, and so therefore it's the interests of young men that algorithms adapt to. And our boys are falling down that rabbit hole. I've been watching it for years, watching incel ideologies permeate up in my debating groups, knowing exactly where they're coming from. There was 11 billion views on Andrew Tate's TikTok videos before he was banned last year. 11 billion. And Andrew Tate is just the most recent version of Jordan Peterson, who's the most recent version of the black pill, etc., etc. There is invisible radicalization going on of our young men, and we're not aware of it. Well, I say we, I mean people like me. I think you'll find people like Sophie is very aware of it. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's my case. There's always been sexism, but something new is afoot. It isn't as simple as backlash. It isn't as simple as a new online phenomena. It combines powerful, intoxicating psychological messaging with a medium that allows for very effective radicalization. I do not have the solution, but I know we need to bring it to the light. We are at the turning of the tide. Thank you.
Powerful argument, but never mind the quality, feel the width to the very second. You deprive me of my principal joy of slamming this gavel into the tabletop. Now, to lead for the opposition to the motion, Deputy Heidi Soulsby, MBE. Come on.
Okay, so in the next few minutes, Ms. Edgworth and I are going to say, well, no, we're not going to say everything's perfect. We're not going to say there isn't any sexism in the world today. But what we are going to say is sexism is not worse now than it was 30 years ago. And we'll provide examples from home and abroad. Now, let me take you back to Guernsey in 1993. Day at a time when tweets are for the birds and TikTok was what the grandfather clocked it. Picture a young woman who'd come over to Guernsey 3 years previously with her new husband and was having an interview with a manager because a license needed to be transferred from her husband to her because he was moving to a new job. Now, that manager sat down. The first question he asked was, "Do you intend to have any children?" Now, that was a true story. It was my story. Was I shocked? Was I horrified? No, I was depressed, but I could accept. It was not a surprise to me. In fact, it had happened to me previously. Now, I know the current generation. I know when I told Mia this earlier, last week, she was horrified. Well, of course, society now considers it unacceptable. It says it's unacceptable through its laws. Back in 1993, we had no sex discrimination laws. The only one we did was linked to the workplace. It was only last year that we said that sex discrimination was not allowed at all, and even that is only going to come into effect later this year. In 1993, there was no abortion laws. Abortion was illegal. That changed in 1997, and we modernised that in recent years. And we've really actually, Guernsey, gone ahead of the UK in that regard, and making the discrimination against women, criminalising them for self-aborting, was changed most recently. And again, we've gone from being behind the UK to becoming ahead of them in terms of free under 21 contraception. When we used to have the highest teenage pregnancy rates in the British Isles and now have the lowest. Now, all this has happened is because women have had more representation in their parliaments. And it's not just in Guernsey, but further afield as well. I mean, things are so different when I was first elected, when I knocked on the door and somebody asked me, well, how are you going to be a deputy and look after your children? I've never heard anything like that since. And at the same time, since 1993, we've got women in major public offices in Guernsey. We've got Her Majesty's Procurator, who's glad to see in the audience, the Deputy Bailiff, two really important roles on the island. We only had one jurat for years and years and years, and now we have 7, which we brought in recent years. The same's happened around the world. We've got more female prime ministers, and indeed in New Zealand recently they had a majority of women in their parliament. And we see not only from those changes, but in the pandemic. We saw female politicians like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand being strong and decisive when her populist male counterparts were in denial that it even existed. We saw professionals like Dame Kate Bingham roll out a fantastic vaccine programme. And closer to home, of course, we had our own Director of Public Health, Dr. Nikki Brink. Same's happened in business. Back in the day, back in 93, there were very few women in the finance industry. And it's very much felt that the women at the time were not supportive of the women because they understood that there were only so many jobs that are allowed to go around for women. But now we find from 1999 that in the FTSE 100, in 1999, there are only women held 6% of the directorships, and now that's 40%. So this has happened because people have seen the skills that women bring. Women have challenged the stereotypes and become more influential. We've seen that in advertising. Advertising, the businesses, they want to sell their products. They're going to understand how life has changed and want to get to the people who are influential. Advertising in the 90s basically had a lot of women in the kitchen or doing the shopping. The only woman in the car was little Nicole, and that was probably given to her by a papa. Now, there's so much diversity in advertising. Women are allowed to drive cars all the time. In fact, the diversity is really something to behold. But I'll finish with another example, and that is in respect to comedy. Now, back in the 90s, the refrain that you often heard was that women aren't funny. Oh, except for Victoria Wood, which she was funny. I saw her live, and she was absolutely brilliant. But this is reflected by a journalist called Christopher Hitchens, who was very influential at the time. And he said this in 2007. The original and still paramount motivation for humour is as a vehicle to facilitate the men's successful sexual pursuit of women. So basically saying humour can only be funny if it's sexist.
1 minute.
Now, at the time, Victoria Wood did challenge how comedy was, and women were involved in comedy. Well, there were no women on Have I Got News for You, or I'm sorry, I haven't a clue. Since then, things have changed. Women are seen as individuals, not just a blob, women, but as individuals. We have so many fantastic comedians now. And I'll just leave you with one of them that I think is absolutely fantastic. And I'm sorry if I can't really reflect her Geordie accent. Sarah Millican, she epitomises it for me. She said, I stopped buying women's magazines a few months ago. It just feels like there's nothing in them for me. And that absolutely demonstrates how society has changed. Women seen as individuals. Over the last 30 years, things have improved, and they have improved for the better for women.
Heidi, that was great, but I've been absolutely robbed by a second. It was a second, wasn't it, Imogen? To the absolute second again. Fantastic. Okay, all right, to second for the proposition. Sophie Kent. Sophie, the floor is yours.
The truth is that sexism is getting worse. The truth is that the culture that Ms. Harford-Fox has laid out is spreading fast because of the impacts of algorithms and fuel of social change. And the truth is that we are now starting to see the impact of this growing culture in both our politics and real-life treatment. However, before I go on to discuss that, a point of rebuttal. As Deputy Soulsby mentioned, there has been significant improvements in anti-discrimination legislation over the last 30 years because of the diligent work of feminists. But the misogynists have been hard at work too. They have been working in covert forums like QAnon for just as long, sowing the poisonous seeds of sexism online and watching them prosper. Legislation is not enough to protect women because behavior is governed by culture, not laws. Sexism does not implode when laws are introduced against it. Otherwise, we would be living in a crime-free utopia. Instead, it relocates, it changes tactics, and in this case, it restructures itself into a self-perpetuating body. So then every like or retweet on a sexist tweet, every rapist who avoids prosecution, and every case of femicide sends the message to misogynists that they are supported and what they're doing is okay. As we've already alluded to, historic patterns of oppression tell us that in this time of political and economic instability, the most impressionable in society will turn to extremism for support on where to direct their fear and anger at the world. At a time when men's mental health is in total crisis, a new generation of vulnerable individuals are being targeted as recruits on an all-too-familiar right-wing crusade for the oppression of women. The success of this crusade is seen in the US, where the overturning of Roe v. Wade has stripped American women of their constitutional right to bodily autonomy. The single best predictor of whether someone opposes abortion rights is if they subscribe to negative stereotypes about women. It is easy to dismiss this as an American issue, not a global one, but that's dangerous. Since the Supreme Court decision in June 2022, international meetings have reflected this shift in attitudes. Just 1 month later, the UK-hosted multinational human rights statement was amended to remove any and all mentions of abortion, bodily autonomy, or sexual and reproductive health rights. Similarly, India held its first March for Life in August, where Christians, pro-lifers, and sexists gathered to demand that the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act be revoked, just as Roe v. Wade was. This is, scarily, the way the tide is turning, and the future of legislative protection of women's reproductive health rights is unknown. This is where we see that behavior is governed by culture, not laws, and it seems that much of this cultural change is about how we see women. Objectification of women has always been a foundational element of sexism and a useful tool for misogynists. However, developments in technology have moved this far beyond dishwasher jokes. A study at the University of Nebraska conducted on undergraduate men found that early exposure to pornography, regardless of the nature of the exposure, was likely to lead to a desire for power over women later in life. So, with today's average age of first exposure to pornography dropping as low as 10 years old, we are looking at the first generation in whom this desire will manifest as a direct result of exposure online. These boys won't even have to actively search for it. As Ms. Harford-Fox has shown, that's the algorithm's job, and one it does very effectively. The rabbit hole here is the spiral of ever more violent pornography, reinforcing deeply concerning power dynamics and creating dehumanizing portrayals of women. The views we see from people like Andrew Tate are fueled by these attitudes, but it doesn't stop there. 2/3 of Bible Belt Christian men admit to regularly watching pornography. 2/3. And that's in a culture where
1 minute.
Pornography is a sin, and it pushes no sex before marriage. This constant drip feed of particular concepts of women and men is seeping into the subconscious and affecting the views we have around women and their agency. The future of this objectification is not an unknown. It's crystal clear where it's going because it's already begun. Deepfake technology has, in the 6 years since its first appearance on Reddit, been used to fabricate hyper-realistic pornographic content using images of women who have not consented to their images being used. This content is often indistinguishable from real life. As the world becomes more unstable, the energy behind movements like incels, religious and political groups, and Andrew Tate followers is building, and it's starting to have real-world impact in areas from policies to interpersonal treatment. We have to be honest that things are getting worse rather than better if we're going to protect the young women of tomorrow.
Sophie, that was great, but you didn't do well. There were 2 seconds unused. Right, the last contribution at the beginning session anyway, seconding and opposing the motion. It's Mia Edgworth. Mia.
Good evening, everyone. I would just like to focus your attention on the fact that there are so many influential women in Parliament today. And I know that, as Sophie has just said, that these young boys may be influenced by the algorithms that they are seeing online. However, we have to remember that we are moving forward in a society where these boys will always have female role models, and this will continue to get better. I will now be focusing my points on social media. Social media was officially born in 1997. Social media runs the world in the 21st century, and I'm sure that every single one of you has some sort of social media, from Twitter to TikTok. It's a place where your words can reach the views of millions, and I do understand that this means with those minority views that are not socially acceptable, giving them the platform to share their views on a wider scale. However, we must not focus on the individualistic views. We must look at the bigger picture and not focus on the things that give social media its bad reputation. Social media can be used to uplift voices, share stories, and create awareness, and build and strengthen relationships. It can be a place for organizations, activists, and citizens to demand justice. I understand that sexism may be due down to culture. However, we can use social media to change this culture for the better. We can share our stories and make those feel less alone, encouraging those to speak up. Now, sexual violence is a main part of sexism. 99% of sexual assault predators are male, and 91% of sexual assault victims are female. The Me Too movement is a social movement against sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and rape culture, in which people publicize their experiences of sexual abuse and harassment. This was founded in 2006 and went viral in 2017, following a movie producer being accused of sexual assault, where famous actresses in Hollywood, including Jennifer Lawrence, highlighted this movement again. This movement has empowered millions of women worldwide to speak up about the sexual violence they have experienced. This raises awareness and puts spotlight on gender inequalities and power dynamics. We can tackle sexism through awareness. 30 years ago, there was no place as large as this. There was no place to raise awareness of this sexual violence and sexual assault. Social media has given us a voice, and without this, we are silenced. I will now be moving on to my next point, which is about women in sport. Throughout history, women have faced endless barriers to break equality in sport. Now, I'm going to take you back to a time where I was not alive in the late 1990s. Brandi Chastain, after winning the World Cup, she scored the last goal in the final penalty against China, where USA won. She was a footballer for the USA. After scoring that penalty, she took off her shirt and waved it around in celebration. Now, you may be thinking that the newspaper headlines after this happened was, USA won the World Cup, but no. They were Chastain stripped on the pitch, this sexualizing her, despite the fact that it is considered normal for men to take off their shirts and wave it above their heads when they score. This highlighting the sexism that was shown in the sports world in the late 1990s. And she was also accused of doing this for attention of the males. Like, how ridiculous is that? Now, in this day and age, it is very, very different. The sports world is very different. Yes, okay, now I will take you to the Olympic statistics. So, 48% of Olympic contestants are women, compared to 26.1% in 1996. This shows how far women have come in the world of sport. There is equal pay for male football players. Male and females are earning the same amount of money. There is a Women's Super League, established in 2010, which is the highest league of women for football. This shows more encouragement for women to take part in football. Toxic masculinity was obscure in the 1990s. Men were told they can't talk about their feelings or express them, and women were told that they have to stay at home with their children while men were out working. As Deputy Soulsby has said, the gender stereotypes are rapidly changing. Men are now encouraged to talk about their feelings as the issue of men's suicide rates have been raised. At Elizabeth College, in a Guernsey predominantly male school, there has been a heads-up campaign where young boys are encouraged to talk about their mental health. Thank you.
Great, Mia, thanks. And thanks for giving me an opportunity to use it finally. I thought I was never going to be able to do it. Okay, now it's your turn. We're inviting questions, points from the floor. A few ground rules, I think. First of all, you may have a voice like a bullfrog, but it will probably be best if you wait for a microphone. And I might actually even repeat the question if it isn't clear you've heard it. So that's the one thing. Secondly, you might be famous, you might be possibly notorious all over the island, but could you say who you are? And if you have a particular connection that's relevant, mention that at the same time. And you'll have to attract my attention with an unmistakable gesture of some kind. And if you are directing your point to a specific side or indeed a specific speaker, can you point that out as well? So I can sort of say, well, you know, call on them to respond. So who would like to kick off? The lady in the gangway here. Is there somebody else that we could line up after you? Is there somebody else immediately behind? Okay, that makes life easier.
Hello, my name's Fiona Brocklebank, for both parties. I'm curious about race and gender and what the teams think about that and how that's changed.
Okay, would you like that from both teams? Which of you two would like to respond to that?
Yeah.
I don't you pick it. A lot of you will be very familiar with the statistic around the gender pay gap, that women tend to earn, on average, 78 cents for a man's dollar. But this statistic isn't accurate. That statistic actually refers to what white women get paid compared to men. The numbers for black women and for Hispanic women are much, much lower. It goes down to 65 pence, I think, for Hispanic women. And there have been branches of feminism that are attempting to deal with the issues that face predominantly other races other than white women. It's called intersectional feminism, but I would argue that that is one of the biggest issues that feminists are facing today, that we're not advancing together, and this is still a huge problem, and if anything is worsening by the polarization of issues on social media in the 21st century. It has to be black and white in a world that thrives off controversy.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie. And from the other side of the argument?
I think it's a really good question, because clearly there are two very different aspects here, and I think it's probably true that women of colour, it's been much harder for them to get to break the glass ceiling, as it were. And I think it's also interesting, just thinking about why was it in America that black women would vote for a black man rather than a white woman. Is the colour has been a real hindrance and hurt women quite a lot. But things have moved on substantially. And I mentioned advertising when I was speaking earlier. If you look at adverts now, there's a huge range of diversity, both in terms of the role models, whether of women and men, but also in terms of colour. And I think it's very different. And I think Mia very kindly just referenced to me that the actual Me Too movement came out of the issues affecting women of colour. So I do think that the changes are happening. I think it's possibly slower than it is for women who are white, but I definitely see that there is that improvement there.
Thank you very much for the question. And conveniently, only a microphone's length away. Come along.
Hello, Simon Gittins, a parent. Does the social media reaction in the Scottish prison system for Isla Bryson tend to support the motion or go against the motion?
When you say the social media reaction, you mean in what sense?
In the sense that is this sexism by the back door, or is it a new movement of transgenderism and gender identity?
No, then we really are treading on controversial ground. Thank you very much, Simon. That's really good. To both sides?
Yes, please.
Okay.
I mean, I think I almost don't. I feel like this is almost a separate debate, is what I would normally say. I think like the conversations around second wave feminism and transgender issues are extremely complicated and very identity orientated. And so I wouldn't take a position on that in this debate, I don't think, if I'm honest. I think that I wouldn't want to rush an answer on something that I think is incredibly nuanced and incredibly difficult. And I think will require careful thought and explanations. I'm not going to do it in 60 seconds, and that's my answer.
I think that was your response, Danielle, rather than your answer.
Fair enough.
Yeah, okay.
I kind of feel the same as Danielle here. I think it's a very difficult hot potato, as it were. Did think about referencing that within our speeches, but we thought it goes up, takes you on a whole different tangent. I think it's the question at the moment, so clearly that it's used and it from both sides. I just wish that people could come together on it. Myself, I find it. It's exasperating seeing that the two sides fighting each other, and while it's like in politics, I get concerned that people can't come together and work things out. But I do think it goes beyond really what we're trying to talk about here.
Yes, but it's a difficult question for feminism, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I
mean, over a drink, Michael, I could talk
Yeah.
about it extensively, but I think that...
But that's... yeah. Over a drink, that's the great argument. But thank you very much for putting them on the spot, anyway. Yeah. The lady there. Oh, no, hang on, before you go. Save you the walk. But next time, over to the lady on the far side.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think this question is maybe for the opposition speakers, but it can be answered by both. So Deputy Soulsby talked about experiences, some that she had personally, where she was asked whether she was going to have children or further children, and also the example relating to whether or not how she was going to do her job and look after her children at the same time. Now, I think it's agreed that these things today are unacceptable, and I don't think many employers or many of our peers would ask us things like that. But do we really think that these issues have resolved themselves, or do we think they are actually they've just formed unconscious biases that are essentially the same thing, but people just don't say them out loud?
Heidi, Mia.
Okay. I think that's a really good point. Do I believe that sexism doesn't exist? As I said in the opening, of course it still exists. There are employers who will be could well not choose a woman because they think they're worried that woman might have children. I totally understand that. But what I'm trying to say is society as a whole says it's unacceptable, and it's said it's unacceptable by having those laws and saying, no, we as a society say you should not do that. And that's why we've got, people can challenge their employer and say, you're not allowed to do this. And I think there's a recent case in the paper that actually is being put forward. So I say it's not going to eliminate it. Whether we ever reach the nirvana of everybody thinking we're all equally wonderful and we all rush off into the sunset saying how happy we are, I suspect not. But I think the important thing is to get that groundswell of a view that makes society change, and society says what we accept and what we don't.
I suppose the question was, do you think it's the case that sexism exists even if it's not overt? That whereas you'd have to be pretty crass as an employer to ask those questions now, the same thought processes might be going on about, you know, how much am I going to get out of this employee? Or
absolutely. I totally agree with that. I do think things have changed, though. I know we were talking about the Andrew Tate of this world and all the underlying QAnon and all things like that. But I think men, I mean, we're knocking men all the time, but actually I think things have changed a lot in the men's mindsets from that point of view. I think education's been a big thing, and also seeing women not as a threat, but as colleagues and people that they can work with, play with, and can entertain them. I think things, just the success breeds success from that point of view.
Yeah. Sophie, Danielle, do you want to contribute to that?
Okay.
Mia wanted to say something.
Okay, Mia.
Yeah, come on. Sorry, Mia. Yeah.
Can I just say that I think the whole gender stereotype has really changed. I mean, I sort of mentioned it a bit before, but I think women, 30 years ago, women were expected to stay at home, look after the children. I guess they were going out to work, but if your child had a day off sick, it would be the mother that would be expected to stay at home and be with the child and not the father. And I just think that this has really progressed in these coming years. And especially, it's now, like, I think back, I mean, when you were asked if you're planning on having children, that's sort of considered the societal norms. But nowadays, it's not, like, women are not expected to have children and to get married. It is now totally socially okay if the women wanted to stay independent and not have children at all. But so I think there has been a shift in sort of the gender stereotypes there.
Mia, thanks very much.
I've just lost because I was thinking about what Mia was saying. So Heidi said, you know, it doesn't really matter because it's what society says is acceptable, and that is exactly right. Laws are created by people that vote for laws. Right, and decisions in a boardroom are created by people who have beliefs about certain groups of people. Now, if you'd asked me, was 10 years ago better than 30 years ago, I'd have said yes. I think the point is that we're at a point of change, right? And so we might not see it currently in Guernsey. I do think things probably are still feeling better. But when you look at, for example, America and the rise of the Republican movement in America, not the Republican movement, but the takeover of the Republican Party is how I would describe it, and the ideology that underpins that, I think you will see, and I will talk about in summary, that actually things are getting much worse. That the culture and what they're voting for and the decisions they're making and the ideology underneath it is very, very different from it was 10 years ago. And I don't think that's just specific to America. I think, as Sophie has said, and as I will say, I think you can see that across the world. And I think the breeding place for that is online, and we're now starting to see it play out in the real world. So it may not have hit Guernsey, we may still be on a positive trajectory right here, but I think the point is that actually most young people spend most of their social time in the online world rather than the real world, and the norms are being set there.
Heidi, you want to
Yeah,
respond?
I've got a couple of points to make on that. Firstly, I think society or governments have been slow to wake up and smell the coffee when it comes to what's happening online. I think that is changing. I think what's allowed to be on there is changing. And also, yeah, we had the whole swathe of populist politicians, your Bolsonaros and your Trumps and your Johnsons, even if you want to consider that. Their whole populist certain way of thinking. But I think we're seeing things turn. People are fed up with that. They've seen what they haven't been able to achieve all the things that they could, all that negativity. And they are slowly and surely disappearing from the political field. And that's what I think. I think things, instead of saying, oh, it's all getting worse and it's all algorithms and we're all going to be smothered by digits and noughts and ones and zeros, I think it will change. I'm positive, and I think we need to be positive for the future.
Okay, next question, which I think was over there. Yeah.
Pinder, I'm a parent of one of the sixth formers who fortunately is not here tonight because she'd be absolutely appalled that I'm speaking. But as I was listening to both arguments, it struck me how I agree with both sides. And I thought, why is that? And I wonder if it isn't because the proposition was basing their argument on the issues that surround misogyny and the toxic masculinity that does indeed prevail in the murky depths of the internet. So is it not the case then, if we look at the motion, we're talking about sexism, which I think is different from a lot of what you were talking about. I don't know what you feel about that.
Different in what way, do you think?
Misogyny and sexism.
Misogyny and sexism.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think the two are deeply related. I think misogyny, I think misogyny is just the current term, really, for sexism, if I'm honest. I think it's the word that we use to talk about sexism against women. I do think that maybe you could separate them by saying sexism is behaviour. Is that, would you, it depends on how you just, we could get into a sort of semantic discussion about the words. But what I would say is that the culture that we're seeing online and is not just staying online. And maybe that's part of what you're sort of suggesting, that we're making that argument. I think what we're seeing online is actually a sort of a need that's hitting a lot of society, where I think there are young men, and I think that when we talk about social inequality, right, when you start to lose status, when you have social inequality, people look for ways to boost their sense of identity. I'm a psychologist, that's what people do. Taj falls into group discrimination. You look for a way to boost your identity by pushing down another group. That is what humans do. You can see it in genocides, you can see it all over the place. I think that we are seeing, across the world, globally, that there are a lot, with the change in society, brought around by the change in technology, brought around the change of employment, etc., we're seeing a real sense of instability. And that instability is people are seeking, therefore, something that feels validating and affirming. And a lot of that seems to be around the ideology that actually we've lost track of where we should be going. Where we should be going is back to the old school. Where we should be going is back to the sense that men have positions of power, that women are subservient. And when you look at these, aren't just the dark corners of the web. I just want to be, 11 billion views of Andrew Tate. 11 billion, right? Like when I taught here before Christmas, I asked all the boys that I was teaching, and everybody knew Andrew Tate. Everybody had watched him. And that was before the thing at Christmas where he got arrested. All the boys are very aware of it. They all know the ideologies. I think you would, everybody, it is happening. And so that separation of, do they go into it thinking they hate women? No, they don't. They're going into it seeking some sense of that they have identity and strength and power and purpose. Underneath that is a need to subjugate women. And the outcome is that they will vote for or treat women or respond to women differently. And that is the stuff that I'm worried about.
You got any views on this? Do you see misogyny and sexism as some sort of spectrum, perhaps, or the one being active and the other passive, or do you not think it plays a part in the argument at all?
Well, we've got those things that we've legislated for which say unacceptable, but yeah, indeed, there's insidious misogyny going around all over the place, like I can tell you. Daniel makes a really good point, that feeling of needing to be part of a group. I think for some men, they have felt that, with women's power growing and their influence, they feel threatened by it. But at the same time, I think a lot of men are really thankful that the expectations of them of being men and strong and they're the ones that won't cry when something happens. And all those pressures put on men are changing as women are saying, you don't have to, fight through this, show your emotions, be more human. I think it's the same thing here. I think the important thing is that we don't allow what's going on with Andrew Tate and others to go unchallenged. It's not challenging it that's the point. If we can continue challenge, we can win through. And I just it is complex. There's no real final answer to this. But I tend to be a glass half full person rather than glass half empty one. And I do think that we as women and those men who are against that view of the world really stand up against it.
Sophie, can I throw a question at you? If Heidi's right, and in fact other speakers are right, and men are feeling threatened by the advance of women, isn't that a kind of implicit recognition that sexism is on the way out? Do you see the force of the argument? That's what's threatening men, the fact that that women are in more significant positions in society and in positions of power and so on.
Well, I suppose there's a bit of a disconnect between what's happening in the feminist movement and what's happening in the anti-feminist movement. I don't think the anti-feminists are looking at what the feminists are doing. There's undermining of these kind of arguments all the time. When you see this supposed online debate about whether, the guys at crosswalks on the lights and they're a man, but there was a whole thing that it should be a woman and they should be wearing a dress. And it's like no one cares, not at all. There's not a single feminist who cares about it. And that's just the start of kind of undermining feminism, and it goes much further. But these are the kind of things people can get on board with. It's quite easy to find a reasonable person who's going to say, oh, are they really annoyed about that? That's ridiculous. I'm against that for sure. And it's the same kind of theory as the algorithm. You get sucked in by the easy things, and it's easy to dislike a feminist movement that's deliberately presented as a bit ridiculous. So when we're seeing feminism kind of working and we're seeing the legislation changing, those changes aren't being reflected in the response to it. In fact, as feminism gets more of a platform on social media and in daily conversations, the backlash is just bigger. It responds to it, and it's using the same methods that it's been curating over the last 10 years, seeing what gets the best reaction on social media. And the things that get the best reaction are the controversial things. So I think that would be my response to that.
Great. Oh gosh, we're doing well here. Can we have... haven't you already asked a question? Oh, well, maybe go to the back of the queue. but thank you, we really appreciate it. Can you go right to the back? That's great. Now, we'll try and fit you in if the questions, and I think the answers are a bit shorter.
Hello, Helen Dean, parent of both a girl and a boy. I want to ask the panel, I sit here as a parent, having been brought up in a world where women are increasingly breaking through those glass ceilings. I don't think you can argue against the fact that there's far more representation of women in high-paid roles in government, etc. And it strikes me that a lot of the mothers of both girls and boys now are increasingly likely to perhaps be considered the main breadwinner in the household. And you've got children, both girls and boys, that are now at school, maybe they're in the prep school, maybe they're in the senior school, who are being raised by women and men who have had the benefit of the progression of feminism over the years. And I was wondering, how do you feel that is going to impact in another 30 years' time?
Yes, but I'll put your general points to the proposers of the motion here, because that sounds to me like a suggestion that sexism isn't worse. That that lived experience, that the sexism situation is better.
Yeah, I don't think that we would deny there's more representation of women. I don't think, and particularly in Western countries, I don't think we would deny that right now, there isn't better laws for women. I think there are right now. I think what our position is that we are at a point of change. And I don't think that... so your question was, what will it be like in 30 years? And I would love to sit here and be glass half full. I generally am. Generally a glass half full person. And I do think, there's opportunities for making things better. But I think those opportunities only come if we look honestly at what is happening. And I think that what we've got at the moment is the people in power right now, the people who are controlling discourse and law and employment, are not the people that are spending 8 hours a day in online communities, right? That is the generation below them. So for me, there aren't that many male friends of mine who are big advocates of the red pill or Andrew Tate, right? That is less common when you hit your 40s, right? Although Toby, who's very kindly here, Toby, are you here? Yes, he's waving at me. So Toby, who is, I would say, a feminist, would that be fair for Toby? Yes, thumbs up from Toby, was saying that when he's online, he was saying the other day, when he's online, quite often that stuff is fed to him through algorithms, just because it profiles him as a younger man, right? So it's fed to him as algorithms. The point is not whether we want to be positive or negative. The point is, are we being realistic and honest? It isn't about controlling Twitter, right? That is not where this stuff is happening. This stuff is happening on 4chan, on 8chan, it's happening on Reddit. It's not happening, you know, in delightful Twitter that's controlled by wonderful journalists and politicians. It's happening in the darker corners of the web where most of our young people spend their time. And the norms in those spaces are not set by us, right? This is the first generation this has ever happened. This generation have grown up and created social norms in spaces that are uncontrolled by older people, right? When we were growing up, we had our parents and our grandparents setting the norms for how discourse would happen. But they're now spending 8 hours a day, and it is Lord of the Flies. The strongest voices control the narrative in those spaces. And the norms are being created by other teenagers and by other people that are powerful voices in those spaces. And that is impacting on what they think is normal and acceptable. You see it in pornography, but you also see it in the attitudes that come up in my classes, that will come up in conversations with Sophie. I don't know, I mean, in some ways maybe you need to hear from Sophie, because I think that probably Sophie's interaction with her generation will be very different from my interaction with my generation.
Yeah, so I think that when young men are looking at content online that's feeding them sexist views and, you know, trying to get a bite out of them for, you know, something misogynistic that they can cling on to, they aren't picturing the women in their life as the victims of that. So, you know, you can have open conversations at the dinner table with your sister and with your mum, and you can see that you can compartmentalize when it's such a different world online, and you can make those exceptions, and you can go, okay, women should do this, women are like this, women should be quiet and should be controlled. But not these women, because I know these women, and these ones are fine, these are the good ones. And I think we can't ignore the generalization online. I think both can exist. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. When you've got an online world that feels so different from your other social relationships in real life, then you can make that separation as a young man who's trying to find something to identify with.
Let me stop you there, because we're losing a bit of balance here. So, Mia, Heidi, come on, you respond to this.
So, I have male friends, classmates from the Elizabeth College Ladies College Partnership, and I would say that many of them would consider themselves feminists. I mean, they wouldn't go out protesting saying I'm a feminist, but if I asked them about their views, they would pretty much say that they're a feminist. And there have been times where I've heard them say maybe a slightly sexist comment, and I've challenged that myself, and then they've realised they've taken a step back and they've realised what they've just said and how wrong it is in today's society, and they've apologised. And I think that what we need to do as young women in this generation, we need to challenge everything that we hear that we don't agree with in terms of sexism. We need to challenge, and we need to make a change, because I think that we're in a very lucky position in this day and age where we feel comfortable to do so. And I don't think that 30 years ago, girls my age, 16, 17-year-old girls, would feel comfortable challenging the views of men. I wasn't around, I can't comment on that, but I'm sure many of you can agree with me there. So I think that to move forward, we really just need to be challenging those views, because in another 30 years' time, I think we'll be in a society where men and women are equal. I mean, I know that I would like to say that about today, but I know it's just not correct. We're not quite there yet. I mean, we've definitely, as I hope I've shown you today, made a difference in the last 30 years. And there's a long way that we need to go. And we will get there through change. We need to keep standing up for ourselves and doing what we think is right. Thank you.
I think probably a last question. I'm awfully sorry you didn't get a second bite at the cherry, but yes, the gentleman there.
I'm James Henderson. I'm one of the deputy principals at this school. The motion supposes that this is a measurable phenomenon, doesn't it? So there's a metric in there.
It'll be measurable by the vote, by the way.
Oh, well, that as well, yeah. And so I wonder when looking at a solution, when looking at what the resolution might be, do the teams see it as simple as equality, or is it much more nuanced than that? Because, you know, is it that? Is it education? Because if it's education, like, we're arguably more educated now than we've ever been in certain ways. So I'm interested to know what they would see when they're measuring it as getting better or worse. I'm interested what would their measurement be? What would be the golden bullet?
The ideal end game.
This is like my utopia question. Like, I mean, the question is not utopian, it's quite hard, but the question is aiming towards it. I mean, I know what I want, because it's why I lead a girls' school. What I want is for each individual to find their path and their voice and their interests and their passions without being restricted or contained or controlled by what other people think is acceptable for their gender. That's what I want. I just want us to be people, right? Like, so that it doesn't matter. In the same way that we don't categorize people whether they're tall or short and treat them differently because of it, I just want us to be people, complicated, different, interesting people. And that's the world that I'm trying to get to, where nobody feels that they have to fulfill a certain role because of the sex or gender they're born into. And so when I'm looking at how do we get there, I'm looking at whether we're moving in that direction. And I do think this is, I guess, my point, is there has been movement in that direction. If you ask me between, like, 1980 and 2005, I would say there's like a load of progress, right? My problem is that our entire fabric of our society is changing in a way that we are not paying attention to, and that is changing, unfortunately, this metric too. And we have to start looking in those spaces, because that is the most powerful community builder in the world now, and it is how our young people are building their community and their identity.
Mia, Heidi?
Yeah, I just agree. Much of what Danielle said there absolutely makes sense, but I don't share her dystopian vision of the future. And I think we have to absolutely be aware of what's going on. And I totally agree with her that, you know, we can't ignore it and put our fingers in our ears and go, la, la, la. These things are happening. We've got to shed light on it. So light is the greatest disinfectant. That is something we have to do. But I think we should be very careful in thinking that all those watching all these things from Andrew Tate and elsewhere are all sucked in by it. There are always going to be the saddos that are, but majority of them of the men looking at this will grow up. They will listen. They'll listen to Mia, who says, that's not acceptable anymore. And I think we have to just don't pigeonhole people who are looking at these things and think they're all going to be hardline extremists. I think we've got to put faith in our young people and faith in our young men that won't happen. But we also have to be vigilant.
Thank you very much for a really great series of questions to put to the panel, because actually the arguments were I thought, fantastic on both sides. So let's draw this to the arguments to a conclusion, a kind of summarising 4 minutes, starting with you, Heidi.
So having a short amount of time to be able to speak. I go forever in the States. I Well, I hope we've demonstrated why sexism is not worse today than it was 30 years ago. The opportunities for women are greater than ever before. We have more senior posts, we're more powerful posts, and be it in politics, law, or in business. Women are stars, not just by virtue of their looks, but for their talents and skills. There aren't such things as men's and women's jobs anymore, or men and women's sports. Indeed, women are outpacing men in the traditional male sports. We have seen that last year, the England women's football team. Now, social media. Social media, yes, it can be bad, and that's the argument for by our opposition who say that it's all bad, it's all bad. All these algorithms are going to really suck our young men into being sexist extremists. But social media is a force for good. It's given women a voice they've never had before, unfiltered, to call out sexism where it exists, building support and making change happen. From invisible to visible, from who you to me too, in 30 years. Women themselves have challenged societal norms, providing more opportunities through making or reforming laws, effective campaigning, or being role models for others. No, it's not perfect, but what you have to see this in context of what life was like 30 years ago. And sexism was hidden and accepted here and further afield. And it's not only for men and women, but men too. The term toxic masculinity didn't exist 30 years ago. And now it's understood, and men are not expected to follow societal norms of 30 years ago. We should be very careful not to look through those rose-tinted spectacles. Now, times in my life, it's felt like I've been living in an episode of Yes Minister. Indeed, I said as much in our first tax debate a few weeks ago. But in other ways, it shows how much times have changed. And I'd like to quote from the Permanent Secretary to the Department of Administrative Affairs, commonly known as Sir Humphrey Appleby. He said, "Now, Minister, if you're going to promote women just because of their best person for the job, you'll create a lot of resentment throughout the whole of the civil service." That was then. Now we live in a less sexist world than we did 30 years ago.
The last word, as with the first word, with Daniele.
I'm going to start with a few bits of rebuttal because I think it's worth picking them up. The first thing is about social media. I mean, I wish that were true. It is occasionally true, but essentially what we can see on social media is that unfortunately positive messages don't get the sharing or the attention that negative messages do. And so that just is why Me Too loses out to Andrew Tate. In terms of the point on faith in people, gosh, that hits my heart. I have love for people, but I'm a psychologist. And so if I have faith in people, it's that they repeat patterns. I was in Bosnia just after the war. I've taught children who lost their parents in the Rwandan genocide. Faith doesn't stop those things happening. What stops those things happening is paying attention early to social movements and change and intervening before they gain momentum. Finally, this point about laws and representations. Laws are not permanent. They are voted for. Representation can be removed. Look at what's happened in Afghanistan. In 18 months, we've eliminated basically all women from public life. We stripped them of their jobs. They lost their jobs as judges. They lost their jobs as journalists. Step by step, it's happened. We've taken away their education. All their finances have been transferred into their husband's control. We might not be there. I'm not suggesting that we are. We're not. But if we keep waiting and believing that these things can never happen to us, then we don't pay attention to the flags that show that these kinds of shifts are happening beneath our feet. The opposition has talked today about how bad sexism in the 80s was, and it was. But the sexism of my youth, the sexism led my Oxford tutor, by the way, to tell me that I must have cheated on my essay because women don't write in confident analytical styles. I don't think was overt or deliberate. It wasn't coordinated. It was a relic of a culture of paternalism, and that culture was dying. Slowly but surely, people were coming around to seeing the benefits of combining all of our voices in the song, of allowing people to follow their interests regardless of sex. But as my partner and I have laid out, that is changing. There is a movement fueled by outrage, fueled by a need by some to dominate and control, fueled by a powerful impact of algorithms that is starting to shape real-world discourse. And we can see it. Nick Fuentes, who dined recently with Trump at Mar-a-Lago, told followers that his ideal world is one where the women don't have the right to vote, one in which women are wearing veils at church and women aren't in the workforce. But it's not just him. Lauren Boebert, a Republican congresswoman, told the Denver Post recently she believes that women are the lesser vessel and we need masculinity in our lives to balance it out. Taylor Greene, who is vying to be Trump's running mate in 24, told an interview last week that Satan was manipulating women into having abortions. Indeed, research last week showed that men who voted anti-abortion were predominantly motivated by their views on women, believing that women are too easily offended, that men should not act like girls, and that it's not rape for a man to force himself on a wife. I.e., these abortion voters were driven not by beliefs about lives of women, but by their growing beliefs about the role and value of women. Lives of children, but the belief about the value of women. And I want to be clear, this is not a Western problem. A study by the United Nations in Asia found under COVID, the volume and interest in misogynistic online content increased by 200%. In India, the misogynist tweets dramatically rose, as did the search for terms like incel, men going their own way, and men's rights. This stuff is growing, and it's breeding, and it's causing real-world changes. Oh, I've got no time. Okay, fine.
No, you've got 1 minute.
Okay, well,
no,
that's something.
You've got 45 seconds.
Oh, God. Fed by algorithms and online communities, it's pulling together people from across the world, feeding them narratives, arming them with conspiracy theories and unchallengeable beliefs in their inherent right to dominate. And it's touching and shaping the views of many. As I look at the rise of Taliban, of Donald Trump, of Andrew Tate, as I see that this week they were looking to ban contraceptives in Afghanistan, of banning the morning after pill in the US, of the law in Missouri controlling what women wear, I see Margaret Atwood's story as, rather than the fable of my youth, a warning of what can be. There is something new happening, ladies and gentlemen, something growing, and arresting Andrew Tate for sex trafficking won't put it to bed. The tide is turning. The time to act is now.
This has been great. And now it's your turn to decide. Remember, when you came in for the proposition, in other words, the people who believe that it was worse, sexism is worse now than it was 30 years ago, was 55. Those who disagreed was 73. So quite a margin. But have you changed your mind? Well, we're going to find out. I'm going to ask you to vote. You can vote by raising your arm. I'm afraid, and I hope all the blood's not going to rush down, we'll have to keep your arms up because we've got counters all around for long enough to be counted. Okay, well, who now is for the proposition? In other words, having heard the arguments, you think, yes, sexism is worse now than it was 30 years ago. So for the proposition, please raise your right hands and keep your right hands in the air while they are counted. Thanks very much. Really interesting argument, wasn't it? I got the sense of, there were two parallel universes here, one kind of above ground where there are more women in Parliament and more women directors and all that sort of thing, but below ground, in the dark corners, all sorts of terrible things were happening which gave the lie to that other part of the argument. But anyway, that's just been musing and filling in time while the counting's going on. How are we doing? If you give me the nod that the count has done. Yep. I'm looking to your nod. Okay. Yep. Okay. Down. Now, who thinks the opposite? Who thinks that it's not worse now than it was?
It's quite even. Let's go tight.
Yes, I think it might be tight. Yes, if you could keep them up.
Sophie's grandmother has voted against us.
That's what grandmothers are for.
So's my colleagues.
Keep. Yeah.
This debate when the young men now are in charge.
Yes.
See how it plays out, because obviously their debate was obviously not necessarily now, but what will be.
Yeah. No, it would be fun. Yeah. We okay? Right. Okay. Now we're just going to get those figures together. Apropos of absolutely nothing, while those figures are being collated, I was doing this Ned thing at lunchtime, and we were talking about how, when you're rather conceited and you're kind of recognizable or something, how people prick the balloons of your own conceit. And I was doing some filming, and they'd sent an intern to pick me up from the railway station, and it was this extraordinarily attractive young woman, you know, blonde, 23-year-old Cambridge graduate and all this kind of stuff, and she was really interesting, and she was driving me along, and I was trying to impress her without any effect whatsoever. And she just turned around to me and said, "My grandmother used to fancy you." And I was a week on this shoot, and I spent the entire week thinking which part of that sentence was the most hurtful. I decided in the end it was the "used to." How are we doing? We got a result.
We've got a result.
Here it comes. We ought to have a drum roll of some kind. Yes. Thanks, Heidi. That's great. Well, now, isn't that interesting? Remember, on the way in, the ayes were 55 for the motion, and the nays were 73. And now, for the motion is 70, and against the motion is 61.
Oh, just...
I don't know. Well, I thought that was really interesting because there were powerful arguments on both sides. But I'm afraid, however you classify the victory in this particular case, on the overall score and on the movement, on how you were swayed one way or the other, the victory goes to my left. Thanks so much to the people doing the arguments. Thanks so much to the people organising it. Thanks so much to the vote tellers there. Thanks so much to Rachel, who did a lot of the organising over there. Thank you, Imogen. A cool presence on my right shoulder here, one way or another. We've all had I had a great time. Really enjoyable and you know, passionate, interesting evening of argument that I thought was great. So just to draw it to a conclusion, Daniele, I think last week.
Yeah, and just to say thank you very much for coming. This is our first big debate. It's been, as you can see, amazing to have Michael here. What an incredible chair. I think let's give Michael a... And also, like, a wonderful audience. I just thought those questions really kept us on our toes. But I did kind of want to just say a particular thank you to the students, because I think the two student speakers, we didn't write those speeches for them. They wrote those speeches. Do you know what I'm saying? That was done by them. And I think one of the things that I think is most amazing about the Ladies' College is how authentic and incisive and different their voices are. So I think just a last clap then to the team. And have a lovely evening. Thank you very much, everybody.